So we are now beginning with the last session of this day. I will give, as you see on the schedule, a short introduction to the discussion between the three theologians, and I will maybe, if necessary, moderate something during the discussion or help them go on when they are running out of subjects or whatever. So, but I will start with this introduction to, which is really concerning the main question whether or not Tom Wright's theology concerning especially present-day Israel is compatible, whether or not it is compatible with all kind of new positions that many churches has taken after the Second World War, especially since the 70s, concerning their redefining, renewing their relationship or redefining their relationship with Jewish people. So I will write my introduction. The topic of the discussion will be whether or not Tom Wright's theology concerning present-day Israel, the Jewish people, whether or not that theology is compatible with recent ecclesiastical declarations like the Roman Catholic Nostra Aetate, first paragraph from 1965, and the well-known declaration in Holland, well-known, of the Dutch Protestant Church, the PKN, on the non-negotiable connection of the Church with the Jewish people. Nostra Aetate opens with the following intriguing words on which you, Dr. Kinzer, have pondered so interestingly and deeply in your book, Searching Her Own Mystery. I will quote from the opening lines of the declaration of Nostra Aetate, which says, as the sacred synod searches into the mystery of the Church, it remembers the bond that spiritually ties the people of the new covenant to Abraham's stock. Although Nostra Aetate is a declaration by the Roman Catholic Church, its impact has been huge on the Protestant churches as well. The many like-minded Protestant declarations that followed in the wake of Nostra Aetate during the decades after 1965, these are not strange to the huge impact of the watershed declaration that Nostra Aetate indeed has been. With Nostra Aetate, the Roman Catholic Church, look guys, this is wrongly, yes, this is the better variant, so we skip this one.
Emendation.
Yeah. Yeah. With Nostra Aetate, the Roman Catholic Church took leave from 1800 years of Christian anti-Judaism. Many Protestant churches have followed its lead after. As an opening to the discussion of this afternoon, I want to read some quotes of you, Dr. Kinzer, from your book, Searching Her Own Mystery. Quotes which are, in my view, just as intriguing as the opening sentence of Nostra Aetate itself. I suggest that these quotes will provide the three of you with an interesting starting point for the discussion this afternoon. The following is from page 5 and 6 of your book, which says, only after, and it's about the Pope John Paul II, only after 5 months being named the Bishop of Rome, Pope John Paul II addressed a group of representatives of Jewish organizations as follows. And then John Pope said to these representatives, as your representative has mentioned, it was the Second Vatican Council with its declaration Nostra Aetate number 4 that provided a starting point for this new and promising phase in the relationship with the Church and the Jewish religious community. In effect, the Council made very clear that while searching into the mystery of the Church, it recalled the spiritual bond linking the people of the New Covenant with Abraham's stock. Thus it is understood that our two religious communities are connected and closely related at the very level of their respective religious identities. Pope John Paul II articulates here the significance of the sentence of Nostra Aetate with piercing clarity. The Catholic Church and the Jewish people are bound together not only by a common past, but also, and most importantly, at the very level of their respective religious identities, according to Pope John Paul II. In his visit to the Rome Synagogue in 1986, the Pope underlined this point by way of another contrast. And then there comes another quote. We are all aware that among the riches of this paragraph number 4 of Nostra Aetate, 3 points are especially relevant. The first is that the Church of Christ discovers her bond with Judaism by searching her own mystery. The Jewish religion is not extrinsic to us, it is intrinsic to our own religion, says Paul John II. With Judaism, therefore, we have a relationship which we do not have with any other religion. You are dearly beloved brothers, and in a certain sense it could be said that you are our elder brothers. So far, some quotations of your book, Dr. Kinzer, about what might be called the heart of Nostra Aetate. The spirit of this declaration comes very close to the declaration of the Dutch Protestant Church, better known as the PKN here in the Netherlands, which speaks of this non-negotiable connection of the Church with the Jewish people. Having quoted extensively from your book on the significance of Nostra Aetate, I would like to ask you, Dr. Kinzer, to be the first to shine your light on the question whether NT Wright's theological conclusions on the status of the present-day Jewish people are compatible with the spirit of Nostra Aetate and the many like-minded declarations by all kinds of churches that have followed since. So,
well, I think that probably in the deepest sense, the answer would be no, a simple one. In that I think that Nostra Aetate and other similar church documents in other ecclesial communities are, first of all, they are presuming that there is some kind of theological significance to a Jewish community and a Jewish tradition, something that exists outside the boundaries of the church. And as I tried to indicate in my presentation, I think that there's no clear indication in NT Wright's works that he has that same approach. I think he recognizes the ongoing significance of Jews outside of the church. But as I said, I don't think he has the same sense of the significance of the Jewish community, the Jewish people, and the Jewish tradition as some kind of ongoing reality that has existed in a kind of parallel universe or existence to the life of the church, and which in some sense the church needs, and where there's a mutual dependence. And I think that is something that is implicit in Nostra Aetate and the other church documents. There is one point, though, where I think that's one of the deep underlying points of Nostra Aetate that I'm trying to probe in my own book, Searching Her Own Mystery, where there is some commonality with N.T. Wright. And that has to do with the role of Jesus himself. And one of the things that's why I single out this phrase, searching her own mystery, in Nostra Aetate, and why I think it's so significant, is that this document is saying that the fundamental basis for the church's relationship to the Jewish people is Christological. It's really, because the mystery at the heart of the church is Jesus. And that's what the document really means. It's being careful, it's being understated in the way in which it's doing it. But the mystery at the heart of the church is Jesus. And what the Vatican II document is saying is that in Jesus is, in sense, the fullness of the Jewish people and Judaism. Or as another document stated, and that John Paul quoted, he said, when we encounter Jesus, we encounter Judaism. So that the church's encounter with Judaism is not like an interreligious dialogue. It's not one community entering into respectful conversation with a parallel community that has a rich tradition that it wants to learn from. That is the way in which interreligious dialogue is often conceived. But the subtle genius of Nostra Aetate is the way in which it very implicitly gives a Christological basis for the foundation of this unique relationship between the church and the Jewish people. And this is also, I think, very central to what N.T. Wright is trying to do. His reservations and critiques of the people who often are engaged in this kind of interreligious dialogue is that they are not taking Jesus seriously. That they are the dialogue takes place in a certain way independent of the claims of who Jesus is, and so what N.T. Wright is trying to say is, to the extent to which the church does have this any kind of relationship with Jews outside of it, it's coming because of Jesus himself, and because of this ongoing relationship that Jesus does have to these Jews outside of the church, and so in that regard, I think there is a point of commonality that's worth underlying, even though I think the fundamental spirit and direction of that these documents point is not one to which N.T. Wright would probably assent. Where do you want to go, here or there? Okay.
Would you like to respond, Wilbert?
Yeah. Well, there's one problem that's always so troubling in these dialogues, and that's that it seems like love comes from one side only, or it might easily be that way because the Pope can say, you are our brothers, and we share the same faith, whereas maybe the Jews who are at the other side of the table may think that he speaks well, but they don't understand, or they don't agree that they share the same faith. So I think that we do need to see that it's all about self-definition. The Church, with good appeal to Paul and the letter to the Romans and the whole of the New Testament, defines itself as having derived from the Jewish people and as a special form of Israel. Israel freshly defined, but many of the Jews who do not believe in Jesus don't share that same vision of Israel because they define Israel in another way. So that makes it very difficult. So I think we can give Tom Wright and his theology a lot of credit, as long as we take into account that it's all about this new definition of the people of God, which explains why we are in such trouble when it comes to these issues. That's what I want to say.
Thank you. I think for me the problem is they're really very clear, but I don't want to be the heart of this discussion because it's between the three of you. So I would like to give a...
Yes, of course, in the end, everything is a matter of semantics. I agree with Dr. Kinzer in stating that in fact Tom Wright contradicts the Nostra Attilio. I quote here section 4:13, and I do it in English and in Dutch. And this is the line, I think that's very important, because it's stated in a via negativa. It's not positive, it says what it's not. It says here, although the church is the new people of God, so here the text agrees with the idea of, I think, Tom Wright. Das wahre Israel, the new Israel. So, although the church is the new people of God, the Jews should not be presented. So here's the via negativa. It should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God, as if this followed from the Holy Scripture. So, in fact, the Pope is also reasoning from Scripture. And it says, we are the new people, we are true Israel. But it's not a statement that you can use to say that the Jews are rejected or accursed. In het Nederlands. En al is de kerk het nieuwe volk Gods, toch mag men de Joden niet voorstellen als door God verworpen of als vervloekt. Alsof dit zou zijn af te leiden uit de Heilige Schrift. Amen, kerk. That's not what it stated.
I understand. You're a Baptist.
And I think, yes, I'm a Baptist. And I think here, Tom Wright clearly contradicts here the Catholic statement.
Well, only the second part, I think, not the first part.
Not the first, it's the second.
Okay, but then may I pose you another question related to your remarks? Oh, sorry, you want to first remarks?
Well, do you think that somehow, because of denial of the gospel, that the Jews in New Testament times were rejected or accursed? Are you in agreement with the first half of the statement, and the second you would say, well, I disagree?
I don't know. I haven't thought enough about that. Yeah. Because, you know, the image of the olive tree that have branches broken off is quite strong. Because who broke them off? And so on. So there, but I don't know if I would press the point.
I would like to ask you, Wilbert, as far as I know, you are a member of PKN Church? Yeah. So when the PKN says that there is a non-negotiable connection, onopgeefbare verbondenheid, of the church with the Jewish people, how do you view that quote or that statement, that position of the in the kerkorder?
The church
with
law, yes.
with NT Wrights position on present-day Israel. So if there's a non-negotiable connection just with the Jewish people, I guess they mean the present Jewish people.
Well, that's the thing.
Okay.
Because it's not quoted right. Because as far as I know, it says in the church order that it's a non-negotiable connection to Israel.
No, the Jewish people, it says, as far as I know.
The people of Israel.
The people of Israel. Yeah. So, well, I think that if you say the people of Israel, then it's compatible with Tom Wright's theology, right?
No, how then?
Because the question is, what is the people of Israel?
But that sounds
The
almost
people of
like
Israel.
Yeah, but that sounds almost. I'll try to be. I don't want to be unrespectful, but it sounds almost like a joke, because when the PKN, the way the PKN is, a discussion in Holland, when there is a discussion about it, speaks about this onopgeefbare verbondenheid with the Joodse volk, with the people of Israel, of course they mean not the church. That's completely clear. Wright could mean
No,
that,
no.
but the declaration doesn't mean that at all.
True.
I'm sure of that.
Sure, no, I agree. But we're talking about the theology of Tom Wright, right?
Yeah, okay.
So he says, in Jesus Christ we see the people of God freshly defined.
Yeah, I
you
know.
know, freshly reworked
Yeah.
and redefined.
Yeah. But when I listen to Mark Kinzer, and then he says, okay, but in fact with that choice, exegetical choice of Wright, of work of Wright, the present day Jews don't have a special, or not as an ethnic people, a special relationship with God anymore. So something has changed then, but I lost the thread now of my I'm getting tired, I guess. So,
Dr. Kinzer, perhaps?
yeah,
Some reflections?
maybe you can rescue me.
Well, I'm not as
Salvation is from the Jews.
Yeah.
That's right.
Not from this Jew. Yes, I think I'm not very knowledgeable about this particular document, you know, in the Dutch Church, but just from hearing you say it, it does seem like it would be a difficult statement for N.T. Wright to affirm without redefining its terms, because it is clear from the terms of the meaning of people of Israel in that statement seems fairly clearly to be the Jewish people. Otherwise, you couldn't speak of the church having a particular relationship to it. And given that that's the case, and I don't think that N.T. Wright could assent to it. And that's, I mean, that in itself is not a critique of N.T. Wright. It's simply saying he's taking a different position than these particular documents are taking. And then you have to, then it's a secondary question of saying, okay, which of them should be assented to, you know. You know, what I tried to emphasize in my remarks is that, which was really this new discovery for me, which was that that N.T. Wright does not simply deny the enduring significance of the theological importance of the identity of Jews outside the body of Christ. Sometimes people make sweeping statements about N.T. Wright's approach to this subject, and I think we just need to be more careful, because he's more careful in what he is actually saying.
But in fact, he's quoting just Paul's letter to the Romans. What's the advantage of being a Jew? And then he explains. That's all he does.
Go elaborate. I'm not sure I understood.
Well, Paul says, what's the advantage of being a Jew?
Yeah.
And then he comes up with several arguments.
Yeah.
And in fact, Tom Wright is not saying more than that.
I think he may be saying more than that. Maybe I think he's saying less than that. I think he's saying less than that. I mean, because I think what Paul is saying, he says, is what is the advantage of being a Jew? And he says, much. For example, the oracles of God are given to the Jews.
Yes.
And if that's understood to be a continuing reality, that that these belong to, they don't just belong to individual Jews.
But do you interpret these verses from Paul as this is the lasting meaning of being a Jew, even in his days, until now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I do. Because I think even today, for example, would the church have the Hebrew Bible today if it were not for the Jewish people? Not the Jewish people before Jesus, before the first century. When Origen wanted to study Hebrew in order to study the text, he had to go to a rabbi. When Jerome wanted to study Hebrew to know well enough to translate into Latin, he had to study with a rabbi. And then for still many centuries, there were hardly any Christians who knew Hebrew, whereas the Hebrew text was carried in the life of the Jewish people and studied and memorized and known. And then when there was a revival of Hebrew and of the Hebrew text within the church, where did they go? They went to Jews and they learned their Hebrew, so that the oracles of God in the original text have been carried by the Jewish people. Not by individual Jews, by the Jewish people, by the Jewish community. The Hebrew language itself only existing because of being carried by the Jewish people. So yes, to the Jewish people were entrusted the oracles of God. So, but as I said, I think that N.T. Wright is saying less than that. Now, maybe one additional point here. I've been in the midst of writing a book about this material that we're discussing today. And it has taken me many years of work for many reasons, which I won't bore you with. But in the midst of working on this book, I came to think that one of the differences I had in my way of approaching this subject from N.T. Wright had to do with our approach to history. N.T. Wright, one of his main arguments is on the importance of history in its relationship to theology. And he brings it in regularly because he wants to do theology historically and he wants to do history theologically. He even at one point uses the parable of the prodigal son to talk about the relationship between history and theology, with theology being the older brother and history being the younger brother. And he's thinking now of history more the discipline of historical New Testament scholarship. And his desire is to see the younger brother, who is history, come repentant back into the house, and then for the older brother of theological orthodoxy to be reconciled to the younger brother of history, and for both to live together in harmony in the household, But one of the things that's always struck me as odd is that when N.T. Wright is talking about this reconciliation of history and theology, the history he's dealing with stops at the first century. In other words, it's the historical study of the biblical text in service to interpreting the biblical text. But he never sees a need, or at least I shouldn't say that. I should never say that. No one should ever say that about N.T. Wright, because he's written so much. You always know that he may have said something somewhere that you have not yet read. And so I have to be very careful. I have not read N.T. Wright to speak much about a theological interpretation of history, of the last 2,000 years of history. And at some point in time, we have to take our theologically informed minds shaped by the scriptures, and we have to look at the history of the last 2,000 years and try to make sense of it. And that means trying to make sense of, a Christian history of anti-Judaism and the continuing existence of the Jewish people for the last 2,000 years, and as a thriving community. And a community which continues in its own to flourish in its own way as much as the church. And we have to make sense of 20th century history. We have to make sense of the Holocaust as much as anyone can make sense of this. And we need to try to make sense of the reestablishment of Jewish life in the land. And we can't treat these things as theologically insignificant if God is the God of history. And so I think the Catholics get this very well. And so their thinking on these issues is informed not just by reading the Bible, it's by trying to bring a biblically informed mind to the theological reading of history. And that's one of the things I miss in my reading of N.T. Wright, and I would love to see more of see him reflect more on in the future.
Thank you. Maybe you, Wilbert, or Henk wants to respond on this mini lecture of mine.
Couldn't agree more, so.
Okay. You as well, Henk. You couldn't agree more.
Oh yes, definitely. But this is one of the handicaps of New Testament scholars, of course. So he can't help himself.
I must think now, I'm not sure which theologian it was, but I read it about Karl Barth or Augustine or both. Something like they said, well, history ended with Jesus. And after that, nothing happened.
David Flusser.
David Flusser?
David Flusser, in his famous book, written in the 60s, 70s, I think, it ends with, and then Jesus died, dot.
Yeah, but I mean that they said, I think it was Bart who says, I'm not sure, that everything which happened after Jesus is nothing especially relevant concerning what God's doing in the world in salvation history as well. Isn't it Bart?
Well, he said something like that, but however, Bart is also the one who said that the most significant proof for the existence of God was the enduring reality of the Jewish people in history. So,
Okay. Yeah.
and so Bart actually thought that Jewish history might be the one exception, to this, so he, and he also, Bart had the same response, to the creation of the existence of Israel.
Bart has an amazing explanation of Romans 9 to 11. It's almost a book of its own. And of course, Van de Beek he's Bartian in some way. And Tommy Givens has, in his dissertation that I refer to, a whole chapter on Bart. This is his thesis. You come up in the end with the uniqueness of Jewishness.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm. That it still remains, and it's there. And it's irritating, but it's there.
Yeah.
Is it irritating? I like it.
No,
Anyway,
it should irritate.
yeah,
It should
yeah.
irritate.
Yeah, okay.
That's how it's meant to be.
Yeah.
It's
okay.
prophetic role. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're running out of steam over here. I guess we are, let's give you the floor now. So you can pose your questions to anybody except me. Nou, ja, die zal ik uitzetten. Ja, doorgeven. Oh ja.
Aan de spreker. Aan de
Elke
antwoord.
keer? Los? Ja, dat kan. Ja, oké, nee, dat is goed.
Okay.
So, if you get a question, you get the mic. Moet je het zo maar vasthouden.
I'd like to ask a question to Dr. Kinzer about his position on the function of the Jewish corporation. You made it very clear that the Jews have a corporate position to fulfill, versus the other, it's more an individual position, which is great to say, but what is the function?
Of the Jewish people, you're saying.
Yeah.
Oh, for the future.
You're not ready yet.
Oh, do you mean the eschatological future, or do you mean in history? Oh, for the church, or in the church, or for the church? Okay. Well, I already made one of the points, which is this, the Jewish people as those to whom the oracles of God are entrusted, and who continue to be the place where one goes when one wants to hear the Hebrew language spoken and to hear the scriptures read in Hebrew, and to see encounter a people worshiping the God of Israel in a way of life that has some measure of continuity with the life of the Israel according to the flesh through history. I think that this is a very important function. I think the Jewish people have also a function of simply a witness to the concreteness, the materiality, the earthiness of God's purpose. And this is related to the point that N.T. Wright makes about the dangers of dualism and the way in which the church tends to float off into worlds of abstraction and overly spiritualized realms. And the Christian tendency towards the universal as opposed to the particular. You can't universalize the Jewish people. You know, it is so concrete, and again, as Henk said, kind of at times irritatingly so. And so it is this continual witness to this concreteness of God's revelation, of God's purpose within the world. And then maybe just a final point is I think there is an enduring significance of Jewish worship in the world that I think the priestly calling of God's people is reflected in one way within the life of the church. It's reflected in another way in the life of the Jewish people. And that there is a priestly calling of the Jewish people, which gets reflected again in the distinctive ways in which Jews worship. And this is related also to this particular calling to concreteness and earthiness, because Jewish worship is very much one which is oriented around thanksgiving to God for the most humble earthly realities. I was just thinking about this. My favorite blessing in Jewish prayer is a blessing that is recited after going to the bathroom. I was just thinking about it as I was coming out of the bathroom. I think about it more often these days as I'm in my 60s, and I visit that place a lot more often than I used to. More opportunities for blessing God. And it's a wonderful blessing. The Jewish blessing recited, it goes something like this. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has created human beings with great wisdom. And in the human body, there are many cavities, openings, and if one of these openings were closed and one of those things that are supposed to be closed were open, where would we be? and it closes like, blessed are you, Lord, healer of all flesh. Now this is like, what other people would have worship like that? You know, come on.
Christians would pray, "Oh Lord, thank you for hospitals."
Thank you for positioning the corporate position, but can Mr. Dekker, can you say that this is important for you? Any significance?
Significance of?
The corporate position, the corporate function of the Jews?
Well, there's many levels on which you can answer that question. The theological level, the historical level, spiritual level. I can go a long way with Dr. Kinzer that it's historically true that, no, well, I don't have to repeat all those things, so it's historically true that the impulse for the study of the Hebrew Bible always came from the rabbis. That's true, even in the Reformation times, or especially in Reformation times. And also it's spiritually very enriching to hear ways of Jewish worship, as we've all experienced this afternoon. So yes, there's many ways in which that's true. The only thing that's really a pressing issue in light of Tom Wright and his theology is the question, what place do we give that in our theology? And well, that's a question to which I don't have the answer yet, I must say.
That's very honest.
I would like to respond to your response on this question, and I have to say I find it somehow troubling. It reminds me of how Augustine saw the Jews as a library, custodari, and something else. And he really gave them sort of a function. And but I find it troubling language, talking about function. I think first of all, you know, God made a covenant with people. So I think language of relationship, or you know, like Song of Songs kind of language might be more appropriate than the language of function. So it's only a remark, but
Yeah.
I know this is talking. So.
Yeah. Yes. Well, this gets back again to the discussion earlier of NT Wright and how to understand the notion of election and the relational. Thank you. Yeah, the relational dimension and the functional or instrumental type of dimension. And I think that they're both important, and that if one simply talks about functions then and misses the fact that at the heart of it is a relationship of mutuality and of fellowship, of love, of partnership, then yes, there's a real problem there. On the other hand, relationships also have ends and purposes. And, you know, the relationship in marriage has also a purpose of bringing new life into the world that's beyond simply a husband and wife gazing lovingly into one another's eyes. You know, and that's not instrumentalizing marriage to say that there are purposes sometimes for particular relationships. And so I think that there are particular purposes that the Jewish people fulfill in history, which we can only point to some and never exhaustively categorize. But I think that if that's all one sees are these purposes and functions, then one is missing something, the mystery at the heart of that reality. So thank you for pointing it out.
I remember that you preached last time in our church about Ephesians 2, and you preach about the relationship with church and Christian, the Jews. It's also on the side of the Jewish website. I think it's very wise to listen to the preacher.
May I pose a question? In how far is the lack of attention of N.T. Wright for the theological significance of the history of the Jewish people after Christ inherently connected with his labeling as symbols of people, land, city, Torah? Because I think he is living in some sort of a docetic interpretation of history and of the election of Israel. So he cannot have attention for the historical continuity of the Jewish people because he labels this as symbols.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. It probably this could use some clarification because when he's using this term symbol, it has a particular meaning within his own system. And the context here is that N.T. Wright develops a methodology that is based on the notion of a worldview or worldviews. And he attempts to probe or to describe the worldview of the Jewish people during the Second Temple period, and then he tries to elaborate on the worldview of the New Testament writers, and of Jesus and of Paul. And then what he does is tries to develop a methodology for trying to articulate a worldview, to explain how to understand what a worldview is. And in doing it, he identifies four main ways of being able to perceive the worldview. Because what he says about a worldview is not something that you see, it's something that you see through. In other words, it's not a conscious thing. A worldview is a set of assumptions, presuppositions. They're the lenses through which you're looking at everything else, as opposed to simply a philosophy, a theology. And so he says, how can we figure out what a worldview is of a particular people? And he says, well, what we can do is we can look at four things. The first thing is we can, and probably the most important thing for him, are stories. The stories that people tell about themselves. You can even think about this for yourself as an individual, that the way your own identity is shaped by the story that you tell about who you are and where you come from. And so he says a people its worldview in part can be identified by the stories that it tells about who it is, where it comes from and where it's going. So stories are the first things. The second things are practices. The way certain types of particularly ritualized practices, and that become customs of a whole community. And you look at these practices, and so he says, well, when you look at the core practices of Second Temple Judaism, part of what you see are these things like that were talked about as the identity markers, circumcision, Shabbat, holidays, dietary laws, etc. And then the third thing he says that a way of being able to identify a worldview are these core beliefs. These are not like theologies, but like the most absolutely basic beliefs about who a people is and what the fundamental problem is with the world that needs to be overcome, and etc. And then the fourth thing are symbols. And it's almost an anthropological way of talking about symbols in a culture. And it's saying that just as practices cue you into what's the worldview of a people, and just as the stories help you to understand the worldview, so the symbols which are expressed in practices and which usually function centrally within the stories that the people tell end up being key for being able to describe the worldview. So he would then look at things like Torah and temple, look at the way they function in the stories that Israel tells about itself, and then also look at the way these symbols are related to the very concrete practices that are central to Israel's life. And so when he's calling Torah, temple, and land and people symbols, he's not minimizing them. He sees the symbols as of great importance, and in fact, he's saying this is the main reason that Jesus gets into trouble with his Jewish cohorts. It's because he's challenging symbols, the existing symbols, and the symbols people hold to with their life. So I don't know if that's helpful at all or not, but the point is, at least when N.T. Wright is using the term, he's not using it as a way of minimizing the importance or treating them as though they're abstractions that are not connected to daily life in very significant ways. But he is using it as a way of trying to say that what is challenged most by Jesus and Paul, in his view, is the symbolic world of Judaism.
I'd like to make I'm sorry. I'm trying to make a remark about this question of instrumentality of Israel. The first thing we learned today, I think, was that you can't separate Jesus from the people of Israel, isn't it? So it all comes to the question of instrumentality of the incarnation.
Yes.
So I'd like to briefly refer to Duns Scotus, who argues that the incarnation itself is not instrumental only to redeem us, but first the incarnation was because God wanted to be with us. A relation you can compare to man and women. That's the basic reason for the incarnation. And to make it a question, do you have any opinion upon this question? Is there a certain privilege over supra-lapsarian Christology in Messianic thought?
Well, in my own thinking, I have always followed Duns Scotus on this matter, and it's interesting. So does N.T. Wright. This is one point in which he and I are in clear agreement in thinking that the incarnation is something that is not merely a response to a problem. That ultimately, this is central to God's purpose for creation from the beginning. The direction I take it, though, is for me, that means the election of Israel is also has a similar kind of role. In that I think it's not that there was always, if the incarnation was ultimately simply something built into the divine purpose, the incarnation was always going to have to happen in the context of some particular community or people. Of course, this raises another question, which is whether nations themselves, the distinction of nations, is itself a part of a fallen world, and merely a kind of, again, post-Babel type of reality, or whether there's something about the distinction of peoples that is also, that's just part of God's creative purpose as opposed to a response to a problem. Again, I would tend to see it as a created good rather than simply a response to an evil, that there are these distinct community realities of human beings. And so I see one way in which I deal with this exegetically, for example, is I look at the creation narrative and see the way in which the way Shabbat functions within the Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 narrative. And Shabbat there is the holiness towards which all of creation is moving. And this is a holiness that exists is being described before there is sin has entered into the world, which is interesting because what it implies is a distinction between holy and secular, or holy and profane, that is independent of the distinction between righteous and sinful. That the 6 days of the week are good, but they are not yet holy. And the holiness is that thing towards which creation is moving towards. And again, this is similar to some of the things that N.T. Wright also points. But that holiness of Shabbat within the framework of the text of the Torah is itself an anticipation of the election of Israel. Like the word holy does not appear again in the text until we get to Exodus 3 and Sinai, where God reveals himself to Moses and says this is holy ground. The vocabulary of holiness is something that's distinctive to the particular vocation of Israel. And so again, I see this holiness of God as what the incarnation is about. It's this holiness entering into the world and bringing it simply from the created goodness of creation into the eschatological fullness of God's presence filling the earth as the waters cover the sea, which the incarnation is all about. And the first stage on that road is Israel, and God dwelling in the midst of Israel. And so for me, again, Israel itself, it doesn't simply exist as a response to the brokenness and evil of the world, and this is one place where I would differ from again, N.T. Wright, where his emphasis is very much on the election of Israel as simply a response to the evil in the world that needs to be addressed. I would see the election of Israel much like the way Duns Scotus and N.T. Wright would treat the incarnation, as something that itself is intrinsic to God's loving purpose in the midst of the world to come and dwell in the midst of the world.
Thank you very much.
I have a question to you, Mr. Kinzer. Paul says in Ephesians 2 that the Lord made of the two one. He took away the separation wall, and he made from the two, he made one body in Jesus Christ. Now, a lot of people in the churches say that the other part of Israel, the part which Paul says the hardening has come over a part of Israel, the people of Israel do not believe that Jesus is the Messiah. That's the largest part of Israel. That part of Israel has not anymore any biblical significance. A lot of people here present really believe that that part of Israel really is still Israel in biblical perspective, in eschatological perspective, and from our belief. How should you describe, how should you formulate the biblical, not political, but the biblical and eschatological significance of that other part of that main part of Israel in relation to the body of Christ? Because that's mainly the point where the discussions always go about. How should you describe that biblical relation and biblical significance of Israel?
I think we do have a problem here, obviously. And in some ways, perhaps we could get at the nature of the problem by going back to the response of Reverend Dekker, who was speaking about the New Testament period as one in which you had a living Jewish presence in the midst of the life of the church. What you also had was a church that still had connections, significant connections to the synagogue. It's not always so clear. We see it in the Acts of the Apostles. And it's implicit in the writings of Paul, who refers to himself as having several times received synagogue discipline. You know, he is receiving the 40 lashes minus one on several different occasions. The only way, that's a synagogue discipline, and you're only subject to it if you are voluntarily part of the Jewish community in that time, and doing things that its leadership doesn't want you to do, and yet you still are treating its leadership as your leadership, because otherwise you're not going to come under the discipline, that particular discipline. So in the New Testament context, you still have both the living presence of Jews visibly present within the life of the community, and you have a Jewish community that is larger than the church community. That the church community has a sense of some kind of troubled, tense relationship with, but a relationship nonetheless. The problem is when we try to be strictly biblical, and so we're living in that world, but then we're trying to talk about our circumstances in the light of 19 centuries in which the realities have been completely different than that, in which the Jews have not been the majority that we've been dealing with, the Christians have been the majority, in which there have been Jews present in the church, but they always had to hide their Jewish identity, and so it was completely invisible, and if it had been visible, they would be punished or even executed for it. And then where the church was not dealing with a majority Jewish community, but was dealing with a minority Jewish community that often was oppressing, and where the whole memories of both communities have been tarnished and shaped by this history. And my concern is with a kind of biblicism which wants to develop a theology that is so biblical that we're living in this first century reality and not willing to actually face theologically the significance of our own reality and the 19 centuries that we've come through. And this is why I made the point I made earlier about the theology of history. So I think we have to start from minds that are shaped from the scripture. But then we have to be able to confront this tormented history and this reality which is so dramatically different than that first century reality. And that takes, I think, some significant creative theological thought, which hopefully will be truly biblical, but can't simply consist of repeating biblical formulas. So I haven't answered your question at all. I'm simply trying to say how difficult it is to answer that question. And yet how answering that question in many ways is a fundamental task that lies before us.
Doet hij het? Does he work? No. Yes, he works? I want to ask, is it allowed to speak regarding of history, of talking about it in these kind of words, that apart from the incarnation of Jesus, Israel is also part of the incarnation, and even the land is a part of incarnation. So you can speak of the incarnated Jesus Christ and Israel, the people of Israel and the land of Israel as incarnation light. Like two paranymphs.
Yes. I think that would be, I do think that is possible. It's interesting how this is, I think, where a Catholic vocabulary is actually helpful. Because, you know, Catholic theology is very much rooted in the incarnation. And but they developed this vocabulary of sacrament. And their notion, this Catholic notion of sacrament, is very much like related to the incarnational dimension. It is focused on the way in which God seeks to be manifest in the physical world through physical things. So, you know, water, bread, wine, you know, and often those of a more Catholic bent will speak more of a sacramental worldview, you know, in which one is able to encounter God through all of these different means. And I mention this because I think that using that vocabulary, which kind of gives you a second level of like incarnational dimension, you might say. It's like this incarnation light, you know, but it gives you a different vocabulary for it. So because there is incarnation, there is sacrament. In fact, what Catholics say these days is the primary sacrament is the incarnation. That is the real, true, ultimate sacrament, is the flesh of the body and flesh of Jesus himself. And all other sacramental realities simply derive from that fundamental sacramental reality. And then within that frame of reference, yes, I believe the land is sacramental. I believe the Jewish peoplehood, the fleshly reality of the Jewish people is sacramental. And I have a chapter on this in my book, Searching Her Own Mystery, where again, I'm trying to adapt some of this Catholic language in speaking to Catholics from a Messianic Jewish perspective. And so that is what I do. But in effect, that is a way of talking about the consequences or the implications of the incarnation.
We are running a bit out of time. Two questions, and there are two answers as well, so it will be a bit later then.
It's
If
short.
you want to escape.
Yeah, when I read NT Wright, I see that before he interprets Jesus' words, he first analyzes his symbolic actions that he's performing, especially when he's entering Jerusalem. He's doing a lot of symbolic actions, and one of them is the cursing of the fig tree. And I was wondering what your response to that is.
Yes. Yes. What I see going on with Jesus and in general, and with, well, what I see happening with the fig tree is what I see happening in many other incidents and teachings of Jesus, which is a prophecy of judgment, and it is a prophecy that unless Israel repents, a judgment is coming, and so in that way I would agree with, it's a standard New Testament reading and one which N.T. Wright would hold as well. The difference is, while I see that judgment coming in 70, but I don't see, again, that judgment as then a reflection of the fact that those who have been judged are now in some ways no longer the elect. And in fact, this comes to my, again, theological reading of history, is what I see happening is through the destruction of the temple, the Jewish people being purified and refined, and a new form of Judaism emerging, which is actually spiritually more healthy than the form of Judaism that existed before. And I mean, I think it's really quite striking, in the book of Acts, of all of the different branches of Judaism that exist, the one which is treated most positively are the Pharisees. It's the Pharisees who Paul appeals to and who save Paul versus the Pharisees, or the Sadducees. It's Gamaliel who keeps the apostles from being executed. Paul identifies himself as a Pharisee in the book of Acts. He doesn't say, I was a Pharisee. He says, I am a Pharisee. So it's very striking that the one party which survives the destruction of the temple and which ultimately ends up carrying the future of the Jewish people are the Pharisees. It's also striking, N.T. Wright talks about the Pharisees and points out the fact that during the lifetime of Jesus, it was the school of Shammai that was in charge, and the school of Hillel was the minority party. And the school of Hillel was the party that actually had more in common with the teachings of Jesus and the apostles. What happens after the destruction of the temple? It's not just that the Pharisees survive and become the main party. It is that the party of Hillel triumphs over the party of Shammai among the Pharisees. And so if one is doing a theological reading of history, one has to take account of all of these factors and say, God is at work in the life of the Jewish people and in the midst of Judaism. So this judgment is not an end. It is simply, it's an end of one phase, and it becomes itself a purification that leads to something else. So I take very seriously the sense of Jesus speaking of judgment. Something does end, and there is a destruction of the temple. There's a destruction of Jerusalem, and these are heavy weights that fall on the life of the people of Israel, but they are also a fire that purifies and renews.
We're finished. Thank you very much, all the three of you.